And let me do the speaker thing. There we go. Um, I met, as I said, met him when Peace Like a River came out. But Leaf, before we start, tell us a little bit about where you're situated, your wife, your family, your sons that are also authors. Give us a little personal background before we start.
Sure. Well, Robin and I live in Duluth, Minnesota, 6 or 7 blocks up from Lake Superior. We've lived here since 2018. Before that, we lived west of here on a farm where we raised our 2 boys. And it was just one of those classic scenarios where we raised them kind of in the countryside with chores and animals. And then they grew up, got their own lives, acquired their own interests, followed their own paths, and left me to mow 3 acres of bumpy yard by myself. At that point, Robin, my wife, said, "I think maybe we should move someplace where we have some neighbors." And that seemed like a good idea. So we did that. We moved over here. And our sons went in very different directions. The older one is in New Jersey, working in Manhattan for Google, working on AI and sort of inventing the troublesome future. And our other son is building timber frame cabins in Bemidji, Minnesota, working with his hands and making joinery that you can't slip a playing card in between. So they're very different. They're the best of friends, and we see them as often as we can. So that's our story in a nutshell.
That's awesome. And Robin is also quite the quilter.
She's a quilter. She has a studio up on the third floor of our sort of tall, narrow, drafty, early 20th century house on the hill in Duluth. And so whenever I'm eager to try out something that I'm working on, I have to go upstairs to the attic because she'll be up there working on her quilting machine, um, and ask her to take a break and listen, and she usually does.
And you head out on a sailboat with cold pizza.
We do, yeah, we do. We go out as often as we can. We used to have sort of a larger boat, and we would go out for a week or two at a time on Lake Superior. But a few years ago, we sold that during the pandemic. It just became kind of a different sort of thing to maintain a boat like that and use it enough to make it worthwhile because it's an expense to have a big boat like that. But a couple of years of not going out on the lake really took a toll. It turns out that I really need it. I need the water. I need to be out away from uh, the usual grind. I have to put my hands in the water and deal with the wind. That does something really nice for me, as it does for most people, I think. So we bought a small boat. We bought a little boat that you don't overnight on a Cape Dory typhoon unless you're pretty intrepid, but um, it's just a nice little boat and it's got a heavy keel. Uh, so the inland sea is a good place for it. So we get out as often as we can.
Leif, it's hard to believe that it was 24 years ago when we met at Chinook Bookstore, an indie bookstore that is no more,
Yeah.
sadly.
Yeah.
Um, but you read portions of this new author debut, Peace Like a River.
Right.
Um, Go back to that year, 2001. What was that year like for you as a writer?
Well, it was really a strange one because I'd been working on, I was writing for a living really since I got out of college, but as a journalist. And I'd been with Minnesota Public Radio for a number of years doing feature stories, documentaries, um, and I really enjoyed that. It was a really good job. It put me in the path of all kinds of people I never would have met otherwise. It was terrific training, and I had really wonderful editors who would look at all my scripts and tell me what was wrong with them. And um, you know, eh, people who aren't used to working with editors, can sometimes be intimidated by the process, but I never ever had a story edited that wasn't improved by the process. So I learned how to work with editors, and that was lovely. But I had this story in my head that I was just I we have our older son had really life-threatening asthma when he was a little boy,
Mm.
and so I had an older version of him in my head, um, still unable to breathe at 11 years old, and so I wrote a story about him, and I did that partly so I could understand myself a little bit better what he was going through. Um, I did not expect to sell the book. I just expected to have something I could read to my kids and my wife. And then about, I don't know, I guess I was two-thirds of the way through the thing. Um, and my wife, Robin, said, I think you should finish this and see if anybody wants to publish it. So I did that. And then the book came out actually on 9/11 of 2001. That was the pub date.
Mm.
Um, and, you know, that seemed the opposite of serendipitous, you know. This dark day in our history is the day that your book comes out and appears on shelves. And that seemed like a pretty grim way to start. But in fact, it turned out, at least for me, it turned out to be one of those things that it gave people at bookstores something to kind of gather around. I didn't want to go on tour for it at that point because it seemed wrong to go out and try to sell something when the country was just reeling from this. But Grove Atlantic called me after a couple of weeks and said, "Look, we really need you to go out and support the book
Mm.
because we paid you a good advance, and part of earning that is to go out and support the book at stores." Um, so I said, "I'll happily do it if you'll rent me a car." It was really hard. If you remember trying to fly right
Yeah.
after that, it was really difficult to do. So I took the family along and we drove around the country and we went to Chinook and we went to lots of bookstores. We spent about a month on the road, um, drove about 10,000 miles, went to 27 states. I mean, it was a big trip. But it became this kind of lovely series of gatherings where people just got together. There's nothing less intimidating than going to a bookstore with a lot of people who love to read, and so I made a lot of friends. I made a lot of friends, and the book made a lot of friends. So
Mm.
it was a lovely year and quite unexpected for me.
Wow. And then we have 2020,
Mm.
and uh, that shifted much here in the country. I Cheerfully Refuse released last year, and it takes a very different storyline than that of Rubens and Peace. Um, what informed and shaped that book?
Cheerfully refuse.
Yes.
What I think what informed and shaped that was mostly that when I watched the news, when I read what was happening in the world during the pandemic, in those early days, I actually started that book the day we went into lockdown.
Mm.
So mid to late March of 2020. I forget the exact date. I should look in my journals and see if I can find that first day. Um, I I looked at certain trends that looked like they were undeniable. The trend toward well, in the book, 16, it takes place in the near future, and in the book, 16 people own everything. The entire economy is in the hands of 16 people. Um, Justice is not dispensed in impartial courts, but at the end of a rope off of a bridge. Um, there are some genuinely disturbing trends that are borne out in that book. And, you know, when I started it, I thought, well, this is probably something that is 30 or 40 years out. So I kind of thought about that in my head as I was working on it. and by the time the book came out last year, it seemed like it was 30 or 40 minutes out. It seemed like it was already here. Um, so that made me look like I don't know, that made me look smarter than I am. I would love to have written that book and then had it have been immediately irrelevant. That would have been lovely. I hoped that would happen, but the opposite has happened.
Mm,
And it's become relevant. I'm not sure that's what anybody really wants to be in a case like this.
mm.
I would rather that the world had not gone in the direction that it has. But
Yeah.
here,
You you've released several books, but contrast what you've seen as an author releasing your first book, Peace Like a River, in the year 2001 with an independent bookstore like Chinook participating, and then now 25 with more conglomerates, those kind of things. What have you seen as an obstacle to you as a writer?
that's such an interesting question, Don, because I feel like in certain ways, some things kind of went full circle in that time. When I started with Peace, uh, I did I did a lot of touring, and I went almost exclusively to independent bookstores. There were some Barnes and Noble stores that I went to, and that supported the book really well. And uh, I always liked uh, the larger stores as well. There used to be a chain called Borders. I went to Borders. They supported
Yeah,
the book really well. Um, but the big stores like Borders and Barnes and Noble were looked at as kind of villainous, right? They were
yeah, the bad
they
guy.
were they were the bad ones. And then by the time I came out with another book in 2008, that was still sort of the case. But by then, Amazon was
Mm,
starting to gobble up a lot of the real estate in book selling with their big discounts. And I've bought a lot of books from Amazon. I still do occasionally when I can't get them anywhere else. But what happened um, eventually, and I would say even by 2018, when my third book, Virgil Wander, came out, um, is that people were starting to even some of the indie stores that I went to were like, man, we got to support stores like Barnes and Noble. By then, Borders had bitten the dust. Borders was no more. And Barnes and Noble was trying to fight off Amazon just like the indie stores were,
mm, mm,
which I thought was really interesting. And then this last tour that I went out on, I went to almost exclusively indies again. And there were so many of them. There were so many new ones. It was a very healthy ecosystem. And, obviously, when you go to an event and the store is packed, you kind of feel like uh, this is working out. That doesn't mean that they're packed all the time. But I would say that the tour I did for Cheerfully Refused was easily the most well-attended tour I've ever done.
mm,
And I think a lot of it was simply that people have learned that if you want indie stores to be around, you got to go. You got to buy some books there. Even if you pay more than you would from Amazon, it's worth having a local store. It's worth having a place where you can just go, be with some like-minded people, and support literature. That's the independent bookstore. And you mentioned Chinook. Um, I remember it well. I remember a lot of stores that are no longer there, but it's been encouraging to me to see how many stores have popped up to try to take their place. Just before Cheerfully came out, I went to a gathering in Cincinnati called Winter Institute, and
mm,
a bunch of booksellers gathered there. And I think there were 900 indie booksellers in Cincinnati, and I talked with a bunch of them, and there were a number of them just in the state of Florida that had not even opened yet, but were there to learn the trade. And they were going to be opening in the next few weeks or the next few months. And that was, that was just for the state of Florida, which I thought was incredibly encouraging, wildly encouraging. Um, because when people pay attention to literature and books and the life of the word, um, uh, I think we all get better.
Yeah. You're of course familiar with MPIBA. I think you attended one. I just was at that's the Mountains and Plains Independent Booksellers Association.
Yeah, yeah.
They just had their event in Denver. It was the largest attendance of bookstores in 15 years.
Mm,
And like you mentioned, uh, a number of new buyers,
yeah.
independent bookstores wanting to bring books to their community, small towns, villages, cities, what have you.
Yep.
But it was very encouraging to see that. Um, we are going to have time for questions. So if you have a question for Leaf, go into the chat and I'll open that up so I can see you asking that question. Um, but Leaf, while they're thinking of a question to ask you, um, in peace, Reuben is suspected of being touched by God.
Mhm.
God is a subtle force and so brave, young, and handsome. Virgil Wander, I love that. Probably is one of my favorite books, the movie theater one. But Virgil has recurring visions. Um, Faith is a thread for you. Um, can you share the role it plays in your writing and how it may serve to inform you as you're telling the story?
Oh, it's one of those things that's just so built in that I probably don't talk about it very well. I don't think about it that much. Faith is I don't know. I get very impatient with the way it gets used um, as justification for all manner of dreadful policy ideas and increasingly in this world for, I would say, cruelty. I think that if I have a goal for faith in my work, it is that to the extent that I include it in my stories, uh, that it be there as something that's an encouragement or that is it's more there to build connections and community than it is to tear anything down. I really a story, I think there's a real danger with stories in trying to tell the story what it is. A story occurs to me first as a function of character. Somebody appears in my imagination, and for whatever reason, I can't shake them. They're there, and they've got a voice, they've got a story to tell. So I get up and I work the morning pages, and I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of morning pages, but
Yeah,
um, Julia Cameron's great workbook, The Artist's Way, prescribes getting up in the morning and for 30 minutes, simply writing whatever comes into your mind. Write about 3 pages in longhand in a notebook. And I started doing that many years ago as just as a way of loosening up your imagination in the morning, first thing. And so what happens for me as a character sort of comes into my imagination and starts telling me a story. Um, and and I go from there. But what I don't do is try to you know when Cheerfully Refused showed up, that was definitely just the narrator Rainey appearing in my head, and I understood from the things he was saying that life had gotten worse uh, from the way we think of it now. That there were environmental calamities that were coming to fruition, and there were economic calamities that had come to fruition some years earlier in his life. Um, but I did not write it in order to try to fix those. I wrote it just because it was a story this character was telling, and I understood that maybe it would have some relevance. Um, But in terms of, I'm very wary of faith writing, because I think that, growing up in the kind of evangelical household I did, um, I can remember my mother saying, I feel so bad about this conversation I had with that person because I didn't get to witness to her, so it felt like a wasted conversation. And I remember being a kid and thinking, why is that a wasted conversation? Why do you have to always make someone over in your image for it not to be a wasted conversation? I think I don't know, that's a way I can't be, I've discovered.
Mm,
And so for me, I want the story to stand on its own. There will, of course, be faith elements in anything I write because that's part of my life. Um, but there's a line between storytelling and preaching, and I think that's a line that most of the time maybe ought not to be crossed.
mm. I'm going to go quickly transition. That's really good insight, Leaf. Becca McNeil in Austin, Texas asks, um, I always wonder with speculative fiction how much pressure you feel to create a deep, coherent universe for it, even if it isn't explained on the page, versus just telling a story that navigates a world that came to be through forces we never really understand.
Oh, that is such a good question. That's just a terrific question because there is that pressure. Um, Sometimes editorial, although my editor did not bring any such pressure to bear. But you wonder how much explanation should you make for a world in stress? And I just found that it was when I tried to do it, I found a couple things happened. One was that I began um, to feel pressure to be like predictive. I did not want to be predictive. I didn't want to. I didn't want to say, well, look, I'm not a smart enough guy. I don't understand economics well enough. I don't understand environmental science well enough. What I understand to some extent is what we all do, which is human nature. And so I just simply wanted to tell a story that plays out against the backdrop of a world that has not been properly stewarded. Um, and so I appreciate so much that question because it is something. I remember a couple of early readers were like, well, this is all well and good, and we appreciate Rainey's story and Lark and Soul and the rest of it.
Mm.
But but it drives me nuts that we don't know how this happened. Well, I don't know. Um, I guess people need different things from a story, and that's completely fair. That's a fair response. But when I read a story, and I'm a reader before I'm a writer, I read a ton. Um, when I read a story, I want the human story. I don't need to know exactly how things got to where they are. I just want to know that my people are going to be okay on the page. The other thing I think you can do if you are, I don't know, somewhat adept with narrative is that you can, through your characterizations of, sometimes just side characters, people who don't have a major role to play, but if you draw them fully enough, then your story feels like it exists beyond the page. It exists off the page. And I love when I'm reading a book and I get the feeling that, oh, here's why I believe it. It's because not everything is explained.
Mm.
Not everything is delineated. And so if somebody shows up and maybe they're only on one page, maybe they're only in one paragraph, but I have a sense for where they're going when they leave the book. Um, that is not hard to do. That's not hard to do. We do it all the time in our regular lives. Um, but then that way I think you can create a world that feels like it's broad and you don't have to tell everybody everything. Maybe less is more in some ways.
Yeah, yeah. John Van Sloten joins us from Calgary, Alberta. John, go ahead.
Thanks for the intro, Don, but I'm going to pass because I like Timothy Jones's questions and the others that people have. So if you want to
Tim,
skip over me this time.
Tim, go ahead with your question.
Sure. Leif, you mentioned, I love that phrase, the ecosystem of indie bookstores.
Mm.
Obviously, you had some history with your cross country trek, building relationships that couldn't have hurt this time around.
Yeah.
But any thoughts on how to tap into that those networks?
Well, I think it is a matter of now. Granted, I had my publisher is Grove Atlantic, and Grove has a deep well, a deep well of history with indie bookstores across the country. So that was a huge advantage for me. I think one thing that really did help was just a willingness to go and to spend a month on the road, longer if I had to. I think it helped. I mean, this sounds mercenary, but it helped that I had my family along. Because, imagine it. We every day we would drive 3 or 4, sometimes 500 miles,
Hmm.
get into whatever city we were in. Have to. This was before, GPS was common in automobiles. So um, I was following a printout uh, from MapQuest that Grove Atlantic would ship to me every day. And I would follow these directions. We'd get into, find the hotel, find the bookstore, drive through strange cities. By the time we get to the bookstore, man, we're frazzled. We're kind of shot. My two kids were along, and they were kids. They were 7 and 10 or whatever they were.
Hmm.
Um, and uh, and the bookstore people were, look, people who run bookstores are kind. I mean, that's why they do it. People who run bookstores are, they're lovely people, without exception. And so we would go in at the end of our rope, and they would say, "Come in, come in. We've got orange juice for your kids. We've got whatever you'd like. Here's a sandwich." I mean, they were just looking out for us. And then at the end of the evening, I would read. Sometimes there wasn't anybody there. Sometimes the place was full. I mean, you could never really guess what was what. I remember I went to a great, famous bookstore in San Francisco, and there were 4 people that night, and 2 of them worked for the bookstore, which I found out. Um, and that was a lovely bookstore. And I had a book, Peace was on a number of bestseller lists at that point, and yet it didn't matter. Nobody came. Um, and so one of the people I read to 2 people who were, not employees of the bookstore.
Hmm.
And one of them was this old lady who couldn't hear. She was in a wheelchair, and I don't know how she found out about it, or it's just something to do, I guess. So I just sat down next to her and read for 20 minutes. And at the end of a chapter, she would pat my knee and say, "You read very well, young man." And I mean, it was one of the best nights of the tour, just because it was personal. She didn't buy the book. I mean, I didn't mind. I mean, it was really good. So I would just say you get out of it what you put in. And because I would arrive at a place exhausted, people reached out and took care of me. And it's funny how that's still sort of how it is.
Hmm.
When I go to bookstores now, people are just incredibly kind. And whether or not people show up for it, the folks at the bookstore are always, wonderful to visit with. And I don't know, they're hospitable types. You know this yourselves, I suspect.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Great
Kathy,
story.
Kathy in Louisville, thanks, Tim. Kathy in Louisville asks the question, did you feel pressure after the release of Peace Like a River to produce another book right away? Your second book wasn't released until 2008. Were you concerned that with so many years apart that your audience would have a hard time finding you again?
Oh yeah, yeah, and they did to some extent. I would have loved to have been able to kick out another book quickly, but it was really difficult. It's hard to write that second book. I think a second book is kind of where you find out if you've got the bones for this. And I started many um, before I landed on one that I could see all the way through. And I think I felt pressure too to write something that would have the same spirit as Peace Like a River, which is, a very particular kind of novel. And I couldn't. I mean, I just couldn't. I couldn't land on that again. I couldn't use the same voice. I had to do something different just for my own satisfaction. And it took me a long time to get it down. Um, but when it came out, I quickly understood the difference between a first book that becomes, you know, I won't say a phenomenon, but it did sell a lot of copies. It sold, 1.5 million copies. And and the second one, I mean, I didn't have the same expectation. I did not, and neither did my publisher, thankfully. They were very good about just not pressuring me. A year would go by and then they'd call and say, "Hey, what are you working on?" So they were great. Um, but it was a different experience. The second book came out. It's a Western. Um, and I wanted to write a Western in part because it would be just a departure. I felt like I had to do something different. Um, but I love the book that was the result of that long, hard labor. In some ways, I think it's my favorite of my four so far. Um, and I love it in the way that you love the second child who uh, who doesn't go out and amaze everyone with his prowess, at this or that thing. The second book is rarely a prodigy. Um, and so in a way you love that one just as much. Maybe you love it more.
Hmm, that's good, Leif. Jenny Williams, somewhere in Oklahoma, somewhere on the screen. Go ahead, Jenny.
Hi, Leif. I'm in a well-read mom group, and
Hey,
yes, I'm guessing that you know that yours was a pick in their Year of the Father a couple years ago.
yes, yes, Marcy Stockman's an old friend of mine.
Is she really? Oh,
Yeah.
wow. I got to meet her last year. And anyway, it was a favorite novel of mine. I think across the board, it was one of the group's top favorite picks. But I was curious, you said that you were in journalism before this, which is a very different kind of writing. I'm working on my second nonfiction book right now, and I've had a novel in my back pocket for many years that's kind of haunted, tortured me. Dawn knows about it. But
And her agent.
Oh, I'm curious, Leaf, what that transition was like. If going to fiction felt like a natural fit, if it was instant love, or if it felt like something you kind of had to like struggle with. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. It's such a good question because you're right. They are two very different kinds of craft. It felt like a good fit for me, partly because I always looked at journalism as something I could do until I could write fiction full time.
Mm.
Um, when I was writing journalism, two things happened. One was that my brother Lynn, who went to the Iowa Writers Workshop, 5 years older than me, wrote me a letter and said, we should collaborate on a mystery novel. Um, it was the 80s. And so Elmore Leonard was writing great stuff, and Robert B. Parker was kind of ascendant at that point, and the V.I. Warshawski novels were very popular, and the Sue Grafton alphabet mysteries. And so we looked at that, and because it's a genre, I think both of us sort of thought the way young men will think, well, how hard can this be? How hard can it be to write something where you know you you know that a body is going to drop in the first chapter, and then the hero is going to sort of put his nose to the ground and start following clues. Um, so Lynn and I, in a fit of naivete and ambition, um, wrote this novel, and we ended up writing six of them for Pocket Books and Simon and Schuster, and they just never really gained a following. They would sell just enough copies to be offered another contract, and then we would write another book. Um, for tiny amounts of money, thinking that eventually something would catch and we would get rich and famous. But that didn't happen. We just couldn't do it, and we finally just stopped writing them because we didn't have the energy. But what that really did was it taught me a lot about how to write a clean sentence, not a news writing sentence, but a good sentence of fiction, how to draw a character. I learned so much about how to keep a plot going, how to keep the interest. Uh, Short chapters or long. I mean, there were so many things that Lynn and I both learned about how to write novels just in that little sort of collaborative experiment that we did. And so I understood a little bit better how to do it. Of course, um, that did make it so that journalism became less satisfying to me. I think it was a little bit problematic because I started this whole time I was, of course, writing for NPR, writing for sometimes National Public Radio, but always for Minnesota Public Radio, writing feature stories. And there was never a feature story I wrote that I didn't know I could improve with the judicious use of a little fiction. I mean, I knew that I could make these stories better. All I would have to do is invent one character, just invent a character. It would have been so easy. Um, I could really understand the urge to take what's essentially a true story and improve it. I totally got that. I never did it because um, it was fundamentally dishonest, and I didn't want to be dishonest. But I was tempted every time. I was tempted with every story. Also, while I was writing, there was a guy who was writing in a small town um, a little south of where I lived at that time. And he was showing up on the AP wire, and his stories were always kind of fantastical. And I remember thinking, how is this guy running on into all these great stories? Uh, wow, his quotes are better than anybody's. How is he not famous? Um, and then, of course, what transpired was he he was caught just fabricating stories, and these were little small stories. They weren't big features. They weren't documentaries. These were 1 minute stories, and he was writing them to see if AP would take them. And AP wasn't doing any fact checking. So he would write these stories. They would be ludicrous. They'd be funny. People would rip and read them in radio stations all over the state. He won awards for his reportage. And then, of course, it turned out that none of them were true. He was fabricating from whole cloth. He was making up sources. Um, and when he got caught, he was interviewed by the local paper and he said, I'm going to write novels now. This is my calling. This is my calling. I'm meant to do this. I'm glad I got caught because now I am free to do what I was always meant to do. So, on the one hand, I totally loved that guy. On the other hand, he was a cautionary tale. And I don't think he ever wrote a novel. I don't think he ever did. But it was a lovely thing to sort of get to witness. Oh, here's what can happen if you're presenting something as true that is not true. So to me, the line was clear. Um, but I ended up doing what I wanted to do, which is be able to make things up.
That's awesome. We'll go back up to Calgary to Mark Buchanan. Mark, go ahead with your question.
Thanks so much, Don. Leif, a real pleasure to meet you. Very grateful for this. In most of your novels, but I'm thinking particularly of Virgil and Cheerfully Refuse, you have antagonists that aren't merely bad people, they're evil. And they're suave in their evilness, but it's
Yeah.
like glimpsing the abyss. I wish you could comment a bit about your understanding of that and yeah, where do these characters come from?
Well, look, if you're going to have a villain, right? um, then free them to be truly villainous. I, I I sort of like writing bad people. I find that it's very useful to me to love my characters. Um, and I almost will not let a character in the book until I've worked with them enough, like in the morning pages. That's where they all kind of audition. If there's a person that wants to be in the book, I interview them kind of. I sort of audition them in my pages to see if they have a voice that's interesting. Um, and what I find is that as I listen to them and I let them talk, even the really wicked ones, even Adam Lear and Virgil, who's, he's a fright. But I came to love him. I came to love him in the pages. And I sort of feel like if your default is loving your characters, if that is where it starts, then you can be fair to them. But I think if their job on the page is just to soak up sort of the antipathy of the reader, um, or even the dread and hatred of the author, if that's their only job, um, then maybe you're writing a thriller, that works in thrillers. But I think you can't really be fair to them. Um, I think you can't be fully fair to a character unless you have a baseline love for them. It's not the same as respect. Um, but there's one character I couldn't bring myself to love in Cheerfully, and he's in there and he's necessary. And Rainey ends up throwing him off a platform. Um, I couldn't find it for him. I couldn't find it for that guy, and that's why he doesn't have a huge role in the book. Um, but certainly Warwick, who administrates on the so-called medicine ship.
Mhm.
Uh, he's evil. He's definitely an evil character. But I also know that I have evil in myself. I totally do. Um, but I've been lucky and I've been blessed, and that doesn't always run the show. The evil part doesn't run the show. I think for him, it kind of runs the show. And yet, when he has this conversation with Rainey, where he talks about trading sleep for revenge. He hasn't had a night's sleep in 42 years.
Hmm.
And by the way, I like the kind of world where that's possible. That's a mythic thing. That's a mythical world where you can say, I want revenge so bad that I will trade sleep for it for the rest of my life.
Hmm.
Um, well, that would leave a thumbprint, wouldn't it? That would leave a thumbprint on your life. And he made this bargain when he was a much younger man. And the way he is a result of that bargain that he made. I don't envy anybody who, I think there are people who do a version of that. Um, they're ambitious for a certain kind of power or a certain kind of wealth. And so they'll just make any deal that is offered them. Um, the art of the deal. Um, and I think it ruins your soul. I think that's what it did to Warwick. And I think that's what it's doing to a lot of people in the real world. Um, so no, I'm not sure exactly where they come from, but I sure like I sure like writing the wicked ones, because I have a soft spot for them. I don't think it'd be hard to be one. I think it'd be easy to be one.
Hmm. Hmm. I'm looking at our clock, and I like to be respectful of everyone's day and time. And Leif, I always ask in closing for some words of encouragement for this group of writers from you. I'm going to piggyback actually with a question from Abram, in which he says, I'd love to hear thoughts on how to stay focused in writing about literally anything. He's working on a nonfiction project amidst all the tragedy and tyranny in the US today.
Yeah, wow. Well, look, this is going to be really general, but for me, the tragedy and the tyranny and the abyss that we're looking into is that demands something of us. I think it demands that we do the best work that we can. And I think that it also, at least for me, it demands a certain Hmm. I just reread a great book. I just reread the 1950s retelling of the Robin Hood mythology by Roger Lancel and Green. I hadn't read that in a few years. I used to read it to the boys. I read it when I was a kid, and it really struck me this time that the spirit of Robin Hood is not like an action movie. It has to do with that phrase, the merry men. I think what's important when the abyss is right outside your door is to remember to be merry in some fashion. Does that make any sense? To remember that maybe the sharpest weapon in the arsenal here is not eloquence, but joy. And so
Mm,
part of what gives me joy is the crafting of a good paragraph, or even one good sentence. Like Hemingway said, one true sentence. There's a lot of joy in crafting a good sentence, and if you can marry that with um, an insight, if you are writing nonfiction, for example, and there's something that you enjoy putting across. I've been reading the nature writing of a woman named Jay Griffiths, and she writes so beautifully about the soil that makes up the earth, and points out, just in the she's not a pure scientist or a pure philosopher. She sort of blends both things. And the way that the soil, this this ultimate gift, this gift that is the earth, that is the world, um, it takes death and makes life out of it. And I think the soil of our work can do something similar. I think we can look at the abyss, write with joy, and produce something that brings more life into the world instead of uh, just pointing fingers or just being angry. And look, pointing fingers and anger and rage and the whole gamut, that is all legitimate. There's plenty to be angry about. It's just that that doesn't repair anything. I'm interested in the business of repair, um, of stewardship. I think one thing that the evangelical world has done in the last decade or so, and probably longer than that, is embrace a kind of faith in libertarianism that essentially doesn't trust and doesn't like much the natural world. And I think the natural world is the greatest gift we ever had or ever will. Here it is, and if we take care of it, it takes care of us. Um, I think that we can bring our gifts to bear as writers, and as editors and as publishers, um, to produce work that feeds the world instead of damaging it.
mm, mm. Well, that could stay with us for a long while. Thank you, Leif, for giving us your time today. So good, so good.
Thanks
Um,
for having me. And Don, thanks for keeping after me about this. I appreciate it.
he turned me down several times, and all good reasons. You were in some far-flung country or out on the lake in a sailboat or something, so you had good answers. But thank you for joining me. I always enjoy hanging out with you when he comes to Denver. So thank you for that. Um, sneak peek, do you have anything in the works that you're noodling on for?
I am. I'm just sort of in the early stages of the next book, and I'm not going to say anything about it except that it really has me going. So I feel really delighted about it. And maybe that's something to keep in mind too, is I think it helps to have a project that just delights you, that you can look forward to. We've all worked on projects that felt like a lot of work to go to. Um, and I have too. I've done my share of that. But if you can find one that puts a smile on your face just to think about it, That's where I'm at right now, and it's quite lovely.
And it's not a romantasy, right?
No, it's not. No, no.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Leif, for joining us today. Thank you, everyone. Look forward to seeing you next month with our guest, Jeff Crosby, who's just written a book that I can't hand grab quickly, but it's about reading wonders. So we'll look forward to seeing you in November. Thank you again, Leif.
Thanks a lot. Good to see
Bye
you
now.
all.